The crystal flutes chimed like a gavel drop, silencing the room. My father, Arthur Sterling, raised his champagne glass high. "To the future," he boomed, his voice echoing off the marble walls of the Newport estate, "and to the sale of Sterling Maritime for $185 million. The applause was deafening, a wave of old money validation crashing over the Gala. Then my brother, Brandon, leaned into the microphone, his grin sharp enough to cut skin. "Don't worry, Jess," he laughed, pointing a manicured finger at me in the back row. "We made sure the contract includes a severance package for your little accounting hobby." 200 guests laughed. My sister smirked. I just took a sip of my water. They thought they were cashing out. They didn't know they were signing a confession. Stop right there. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I want to see who is awake and ready for the truth. I didn't storm out. I didn't throw my drink. Emotions are liabilities in my line of work, and tonight I was strictly business. I slid my phone from my clutch, the screen glowing with a single notification from the Vanguard Capital secure app. Wire transfer pending approval. My thumb hovered over the screen. One tap and the money would move. One tap and their illusion of victory would be locked in forever. My father caught my eye from the head table. He was beaming, clutching his pearls, or rather, clutching my mother who wore the pearls like a shield. Brandon was already pouring another round of vintage champagne, high-fiving investors who looked more like sharks in tuxedos. Melissa was showing off her diamond ring, probably calculating how many designer bags her share of the sale would buy. The air in the ballroom smelled of roasted duck and sea salt, the signature scent of Newport wealth. But underneath it, if you knew where to look, was the stench of rust. Sterling Maritime was a rotting carcass wrapped in a tuxedo. My father stood at the podium, looking out at the marina where our fleet was docked. He saw a legacy. I saw depreciating assets and uninsurable liabilities. "To Vanguard Capital," Brandon shouted, raising his glass again. "To the partners who finally saw the true value of the Sterling name." I almost smiled. Value is a funny word. To them, value was the name painted on the hull. To me, value was the debt-to-equity ratio, hidden in the ledgers they never bothered to read. They thought Vanguard was a white knight riding in to fund their retirement. They had no idea the knight was actually the executioner, and she was sitting at table 19, drinking tap water. My phone buzzed again. Confirm transaction? I looked at my father one last time. He met my gaze for a split second, then looked away, dismissing me as he always did. The quiet daughter, the boring one, the one who liked math more than parties. He had no clue that the boring math was the only thing keeping the bank from seizing his house tomorrow morning. I tapped approve. The screen flashed green. Transfer complete. The trap was sprung. The money was theirs, technically. But the strings attached to it were made of steel, and I held every single one of them. Let them enjoy the champagne tonight. Tomorrow, they would choke on the bubbles. To understand why I pulled the trigger on the wire transfer, you have to understand that this wasn't an impulse buy. It was a rescue mission 10 years in the making. I remember the exact moment I realized I was invisible to them. I was 20 years old, sitting in my father's mahogany-paneled library, clutching a binder thick with market analysis. I had spent my entire summer break mapping out a modernization plan for the fleet. Automation for the loading docks, fuel efficiency upgrades for the Atlantic crossings, and a shift away from volatile spot markets. It was unsexy, boring, profitable work. Brandon, on the other hand, walked in with a single slide deck titled Sterling, the Lifestyle. He pitched a rebrand. New logos, a sponsorship deal with a regatta, and a pivot to luxury yacht transport. He spoke in buzzwords that floated like cheap balloons. Synergy, brand equity, disruptive luxury. My father didn't look at my fuel charts. He looked at Brandon like he was seeing a reflection of his own glory days. "Shipping is about relationships, Jessica," my father had said, pushing my binder aside without opening it. Your brother understands the soul of the business. You're too focused on the engine room." I didn't argue. I didn't beg him to look at the numbers. I realized then that to my father, I wasn't a strategist. I was just the help. So I packed my bags and my spreadsheets and moved to New York. I stopped trying to inherit the kingdom and started building my own. For a decade, I watched Sterling Maritime from a distance, not as a daughter, but as a predator. I founded Vanguard Capital on the principle that numbers don't lie, even when CEOs do. While I was pulling 18-hour days analyzing distressed assets and turning around failing logistics firms in the North Sea, my siblings were busy playing executive. Quarterly reports tell a vivid story if you know how to read them. I saw the bleed. Melissa spent $200,000 on a corporate retreat in Tulum that was really just a photo shoot for her personal Instagram. She'd billed the company for branding consultation, but the only thing she branded was her own ego. Brandon was worse. He ignored the aging engines of our commercial freighters to invest company capital into blockchain logistics schemes that evaporated into thin air. The surest sign of the rot wasn't in the bank accounts, though. It was in the captain's log. My father used to keep a leather-bound journal on his desk, recording every voyage, every storm, every cargo load. It was the heartbeat of the company. When I visited for Christmas 3 years ago, I saw the logbook sitting on a high shelf, covered in a thick layer of gray dust. The spine was stiff and unbroken. He hadn't written an entry in years. He had stopped being a captain and started being a mascot for Brandon's delusions. That was when I knew the Sterling Maritime I loved was already a ghost ship. They were sailing on reputation alone, letting the hull rust out from under them while they polished the brass railings on the upper deck. I didn't buy the company to steal their legacy. I bought it because I was the only one who remembered that a ship is supposed to float, not just look pretty in a harbor. They called it betrayal. I called it damage control. The gala dinner was a spectacle of gluttony disguised as sophistication. Waiters circled like sharks, carrying silver trays of lobster tails and Wagyu beef sliders, while the Newport elite gorged themselves on the illusion of endless prosperity. The ice sculpture of a cargo ship in the center of the room was already beginning to weep onto the tablecloth, a perfect metaphor for the evening. My mother found me first. She didn't approach me with a hug or a question about my life in New York. She approached me like a PR manager handling a crisis. "Jessica, fix your face," Patricia hissed, her smile frozen in place for the benefit of the photographers nearby. "You look like you're at a funeral. This is the biggest night in our family's history. Try to look like you belong here." I am at a funeral, I thought, but I kept my expression neutral. I'm just the only one who knows the body is still warm. "I'm fine, Mother," I said, my voice flat. "Just admiring the ice sculpture. It's melting fast." She narrowed her eyes, detecting the subtext, but choosing to ignore it. "Just don't ruin the photos. We need to project unity for the investors." Unity. A fascinating concept for a woman who hadn't called me on my birthday in 4 years. She turned and fluttered away to charm a senator's wife, leaving me to the wolves. The bar seemed like the only neutral ground, so I drifted there, passing a cluster of potential investors surrounding Brandon. He was holding court, a scotch in one hand, gesturing wildly with the other. "Vanguard Capital saw my vision immediately," Brandon was saying, his voice loud enough to carry over the jazz band. "They understood that the future of shipping isn't just moving boxes, it's about the narrative. I architected this deal because I knew we needed a partner who could scale my strategy globally." I took a sip of water to wash down the bile. His strategy. Brandon wouldn't know a strategy if it hit him in the face with a spreadsheet. Vanguard hadn't bought Sterling because of Brandon's vision. We bought it because my algorithms flagged Sterling as a distressed asset with high salvage value due to executive incompetence. He wasn't the architect of the deal. He was the structural weakness that made the takeover possible. Before I could move away, Melissa intercepted me. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on my simple black dress. It was a tailored piece from a quiet Italian designer, worth more than her entire heavily logoed outfit. But to her, lack of flash meant lack of funds. "Cute," she said, her tone dripping with faux sympathy. "Is that vintage? Or did you just grab something off the rack at the mall? You know, once the sale closes, I could lend you a few thousand. Get you something that doesn't scream entry level." I checked the time. 11:58 p.m. 2 minutes until the midnight wire cut off. "I don't need a loan, Melissa, but keep your checkbook handy. You might need to cover your own tab soon." She laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "God, you're always so bitter. Just be happy for us, Jess. We won." The final blow came from my father. I found him near the exit, looking out at the dark ocean. For a second, I felt a flicker of the old hope, that maybe, privately, he would acknowledge me. "Dad," I said softly. He turned, his face hardening when he saw it was me. "Not now, Jessica. I just wanted to ask, do you really think Brandon can handle the transition? Vanguard is going to demand rigorous compliance." He slammed his glass down on a high-top table. "Stop it. Why can't you just support your brother? You've been jealous of him since you were children. Brandon is the future of this company. He's the one securing our legacy. You chose to leave. You chose to be a stranger. So let the people who actually care about this family enjoy their success." The flicker of hope died instantly. It was replaced by a cold, metallic clarity. He was right. I was a stranger, and strangers don't offer mercy. I looked at my watch. "Midnight, Dad," I said, stepping back, "because it's the last thing he's ever going to give you." I walked away. The emotional statute of limitations had just expired. It was time for the professional escalation. The next morning, the Sterling estate smelled of stale champagne and regret. The euphoria of the gala had evaporated, replaced by the pounding headaches of a massive collective hangover. I arrived at 9 o'clock sharp. I didn't come alone. Behind me were 4 auditors from Vanguard's forensic accounting unit and 2 corporate attorneys specializing in hostile restructuring. We walked up the gravel driveway in a phalanx of charcoal suits, the crunch of our footsteps the only sound in the humid morning air. We entered the library without knocking. My family was gathered around the long oak table, nursing coffees and looking disheveled. Brandon was still wearing his dress shirt from the night before, unbuttoned at the collar. My father looked up, bleary-eyed, confused by the intrusion. "Jessica?" he asked, squinting. "What are you doing here? And who are these people?" Silence is a power move. I walked past him to the head of the table, Brandon's usual seat, and placed a heavy 3-inch binder onto the polished wood. The thud echoed like a gunshot. "This is a closed meeting, Jessica," Brandon snapped, trying to muster some authority despite his bloodshot eyes. "We're waiting for the Vanguard representatives to sign the closing docs. Get out." I remained standing. My team fanned out around the room, taking positions like sentries. "Brandon," I said, my voice calm and devoid of warmth, "you are waiting for the Vanguard representatives, and we are here." He blinked, laughing nervously. "What? You? Stop playing games. Where is the CEO?" I ignored him and opened the binder to the first tab. Per Article 4, Section C of the Acquisition Agreement, Vanguard Capital reserves the right to conduct a final binding forensic audit prior to the release of funds held in escrow, I recited, citing the contract they had signed without reading. "This morning at 8 o'clock, our algorithms completed a reconciliation of your commercial fleet's operating expenses against your reported revenue." I looked at Melissa. "You reported $250,000 in marketing expenses last quarter. Our audit tracks that capital to a series of personal luxury expenditures in Tulum, Paris, and Milan. That is corporate embezzlement, Melissa. IRS Form 3949A. Melissa's face went pale. That was for brand building." I turned to my father. "And you, Arthur. You signed off on the solvency statements. You certified that the fleet was fully insured and operational." I slid a stack of photos across the table. They showed the rusted, stripped hulls of 3 cargo ships docked in a salvage yard in Charleston. Ships that were listed on the books as active assets. This is fraud, Dad. Securities fraud, bank fraud, insurance fraud. Brandon stood up, knocking his chair over. Who do you think you are? You're a low-level analyst? You can't just barge in here with fake lawyers. I looked him dead in the eye. I am not an analyst, Brandon. And these aren't fake lawyers. They are here to offer you a choice. A choice? My father whispered, finally realizing the gravity of the situation. Yes, I said, leaning forward, my hands resting on the leather binder. We can proceed with the sale, in which case the purchase price will be adjusted to reflect the verified value of the company, which after deducting the embezzlement and the fraud penalties is effectively 0. Or, I paused, letting the silence crush them. Or I can turn this binder over to the SEC and the district attorney's office. You'll lose the house, the boats, and your freedom. The room was silent. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. The same clock that had ticked through 10 years of my silence. Who sent you? Brandon hissed, his voice trembling. Who is running Vanguard? I closed the binder. Turn to page 42, Brandon. Look at the signature block for the managing partner. He flipped the pages with shaking hands. His eyes scanned the document, and then they widened in horror. He looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. No, he whispered. Tell them, Brandon, I commanded. He swallowed hard. It says Jessica Sterling. The name hung in the air like smoke after a demolition. Jessica Sterling. My mother gasped, a sharp, ragged sound that betrayed the sudden collapse of her world. Brandon stared at the signature block, his face draining of color until he looked like a wax figure melting under heat. You? He whispered, his voice cracking. You own Vanguard? But you live in a studio apartment. You take the subway. Justification is for people with guilty consciences. I didn't need to explain my lifestyle choices to a man who leased a Porsche he couldn't afford to put gas in. Instead, I reached over and flipped the binder to the next section. Tab C, Fleet Maintenance. Let's talk about the ships, Brandon, I said, my tone clinical. Or rather, let's talk about the ships that don't exist. I pointed to a series of invoices. According to these records, Sterling Maritime spent $400,000 last year overhauling the engines of the SS Sovereign. New pistons, updated navigation systems, hull reinforcement. Impressive work. My father nodded, grasping at straws. Yes, exactly. We invested heavily in the fleet. That's why the cash flow was tight. I looked at him with genuine pity. Dad, the Sovereign hasn't left dry dock in 18 months. I had a drone fly over the Charleston yard 3 days ago. I pulled out a high-resolution, glossy photo. It showed a rust bucket of a ship, stripped of its bridge, sitting in a pool of oily water. There were no new engines. There was no reinforced hull. It was scrap metal. So I continued. The question is, where did the $400,000 go? I turned the page. A wire transfer record. It went to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. A company registered to one Brandon Sterling. The room went dead silent. My father looked at his son, his eyes wide with a betrayal that cut deeper than any bankruptcy. Brandon? My father choked out. Tell me she's lying. Brandon started to stammer, sweating profusely. Dad, it was a temporary loan. I was going to pay it back once the crypto market rebounded. I was trying to diversify our portfolio. You embezzled operating capital to gamble on digital coins, I corrected. And in doing so, you voided the fleet's insurance policies. If one of those ships had sunk, Sterling Maritime would have faced a liability suit that would have taken everything. The house, the pensions, everything. But that's not the worst part, I added, leaning back in my chair. I signaled to one of my lawyers, who placed a single sheet of paper on the table. It was a foreclosure notice. You see, banks get nervous when they see maintenance logs that don't match inspection reports. 18 months ago, the First National Bank of Providence prepared to call in your loans. They were going to seize the fleet and auction off this estate to cover the debt. I paused, watching the realization dawn on them. They didn't do it because someone stepped in and bought the debt. Someone who convinced the risk officers that under new management, the company could be salvaged. My index finger rested on the foreclosure notice. I didn't just buy your company today, Dad. I've owned your mortgage for a year and a half. I am the only reason you are sleeping in this house and not in a motel. I am the bank. And today, the loan is due. My father slumped into his chair, looking suddenly ancient. The rugged captain who had commanded respect for 40 years was gone, replaced by a broken old man, realizing he had bet on the wrong horse. "Tell them, Brandon," I commanded. He swallowed hard. It says Jessica Sterling. The name hung in the air like smoke after a demolition. Jessica Sterling. My mother gasped, a sharp, ragged sound that betrayed the sudden collapse of her world. Brandon stared at the signature block, his face draining of color until he looked like a wax figure melting under heat. "You?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "You own Vanguard? But you live in a studio apartment. You take the subway. Justification is for people with guilty consciences." I didn't need to explain my lifestyle choices to a man who leased a Porsche he couldn't afford to put gas in. Instead, I reached over and flipped the binder to the next section. Tab C, Fleet Maintenance. "Let's talk about the ships, Brandon," I said, my tone clinical. "Or rather, let's talk about the ships that don't exist." I pointed to a series of invoices. According to these records, Sterling Maritime spent $400,000 last year overhauling the engines of the SS Sovereign. New pistons, updated navigation systems, hull reinforcement. Impressive work. My father nodded, grasping at straws. "Yes, exactly. We invested heavily in the fleet. That's why the cash flow was tight." I looked at him with genuine pity. "Dad, the Sovereign hasn't left dry dock in 18 months. I had a drone fly over the Charleston yard 3 days ago. I pulled out a high-resolution glossy photo. It showed a rust bucket of the ship, stripped of its bridge, sitting in a pool of oily water. There were no new engines. There was no reinforced hull. It was scrap metal." So, I continued, "the question is, where did the $400,000 go?" I turned the page. A wire transfer record. It went to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. A company registered to one Brandon Sterling. The room went dead silent. My father looked at his son, his eyes wide with a betrayal that cut deeper than any bankruptcy. "Brandon?" my father choked out. "Tell me she's lying." Brandon started to stammer, sweating profusely. "Dad, it was a temporary loan. I was going to pay it back once the crypto market rebounded. I was trying to diversify our portfolio." "You embezzled operating capital to gamble on digital coins," I corrected. "And in doing so, you voided the fleet's insurance policies. If one of those ships had sunk, Sterling Maritime would have faced a liability suit that would have taken everything. The house, the pensions, everything. But that's not the worst part," I added, leaning back in my chair. I signaled to one of my lawyers, who placed a single sheet of paper on the table. It was a foreclosure notice. You see, banks get nervous when they see maintenance logs that don't match inspection reports. 18 months ago, the First National Bank of Providence prepared to call in your loans. They were going to seize the fleet and auction off this estate to cover the debt. I paused, watching the realization dawn on them. They didn't do it because someone stepped in and bought the debt. Someone who convinced the risk officers that under new management, the company could be salvaged. My index finger rested on the foreclosure notice. "I didn't just buy your company today, Dad. I've owned your mortgage for a year and a half. I am the only reason you are sleeping in this house and not in a motel. I am the bank. And today, the loan is due." My father slumped into his chair, looking suddenly ancient. The rugged captain who had commanded respect for 40 years was gone, replaced by a broken old man, realizing he had bet on the wrong horse. "Harper. Jessica," he corrected himself, his voice trembling. "Why? If you had this kind of capital, this kind of power, why the charade? Why let us think you were nothing?" I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the manicured lawn where I used to play alone while Brandon was being groomed for leadership. "Because if I had told you," I said, turning back to face them, you would have claimed my success as your own. You would have told the world that sterling blood inevitably rises to the top. You would have turned my hard work into a trophy for your mantle. I walked back to the table, my voice dropping to a register that commanded absolute silence. You think I left because I was sulking? I asked. I left because I learned a truth that you forgot. Influence is loud, but power is silent. While Brandon was posting photos of his hustle on social media, I was in a basement office in Manhattan, analyzing supply chains until my eyes bled. I missed Christmas dinners not because I didn't love you, but because I was building the leverage necessary to save you from yourselves. I looked at my mother, who was weeping into a napkin. I spent 8 years in the dark, building an empire brick by brick, so that when the time came, I wouldn't have to ask for a seat at this table. I could buy the table. My father looked down at his hands. You're right, he whispered. We underestimated you. But you can't just fire your brother. He's family. He needs to learn. I laughed, a short, sharp sound. He had 15 years to learn, Dad. He didn't want to learn the business. He wanted to inherit the lifestyle. I leaned in close to my father. There is a difference between inheritance and command, Arthur. Inheritance is what you give to a child you love. Command is what you yield to a leader you fear. Brandon wanted the inheritance. He never earned the command. I gestured to the lawyers. The contract is non-negotiable. I am acquiring 100% of Sterling Maritime. You and Mom will receive a full buyout, enough to retire in luxury, far away from the wreckage Brandon created. But the management team is terminated effective immediately. And Brandon? My father asked, his voice weak. I looked at my brother, who was slumped in his chair, defeated. That depends, I said, on whether he's finally ready to do an honest day's work. The papers were signed in silence. The stroke of a pen ended a century of family ownership and began the era of Vanguard control. My parents left the library first, looking relieved, as if a heavy weight had been lifted from their necks. They were safe. Their retirement was secure. They would spend the rest of their days in Palm Beach, telling their friends that their daughter, the financial genius, had structured a brilliant exit strategy. They would rewrite history to make themselves the heroes. I didn't care. I didn't need their validation. I had their company. Brandon and Melissa remained. They looked like castaways on a desert island. So, Brandon said, staring at the floor, I guess this is it. Do you want the keys to the office? Keep them, I said. He looked up, confused. You're going to need them to open up in the morning. 2 documents slid across the mahogany. They weren't executive contracts. The fraud investigation goes away on one condition, I said. You work it off. Brandon looked at the paper. Dock Operations Coordinator? It's an entry-level position, I explained. You'll be logging cargo, checking manifests, and physically inspecting the hulls for rust. You report to the yard foreman, not me. You start at 6 in the morning. The pay is $45,000 a year. And me? Melissa asked, horrified, reading her contract. Inventory clerk? You like fashion, Melissa. Now you can manage the inventory of crew uniforms and safety gear. You'll learn the cost of every single item that keeps this company running. If a single hard hat goes missing, it comes out of your paycheck. They stared at me, waiting for the punchline, waiting for the cruelty. But there was no cruelty in my eyes, only standards. You wanted a legacy, I told them, my voice softening for the first time. Legacies aren't found in a bank account. They're built in the mud, in the cold, in the early hours when no one is watching. I'm giving you the chance I never got. I'm giving you the chance to earn it. I turned and walked out onto the balcony. The sea air filled my lungs, cleaner than it had ever tasted. Below, in the harbor, the engines of a Sterling freighter rumbled to life, a deep bass thrum that vibrated in my chest. It was the sound of competence. I pulled out my phone and opened the old spreadsheet, the one titled The Debt. I looked at the numbers one last time. Then, I hit delete. If you believe respect is earned in the trenches, not given at the dinner table, hit that subscribe button. Never let anyone tell you your silence is weakness. Sometimes it's just the quiet before the conquest.